Welcome to Bake This Book. My name's Erik Fabian. I'm a home baker and co-founder of Sarah House. Today, we're going to be talking with cookbook authors, folks who focus on naturally fermented sourdough breads and pastries. We're going to talk about their books, how they were made, the recipes inside, and tips for making your next bake a really great bake. Here we go. Hi, everybody. Erik here, and I'm joined today by a very special guest, Sarah Owens, the author of 3 cookbooks that you probably all have on your shelf. We're here today to talk about the 10th anniversary of her James Beard Award-winning sourdough recipes for rustic fermented breads, sweets, savories, and more, published by Roost Books. Sarah, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today.
Before we talk about your book, I want to set the stage and just ask you to imagine with me for a second that somebody just put in their headphones and turned on this podcast, and they're pulling some flour out of the shelf, and they're getting their bowls and their scale, and they're about to bake a loaf of sourdough bread. And you're standing in their kitchen, shoulder to shoulder with them. What's one tip that you would give this baker to have a really great bake today?
Ooh. I always do this when I teach classes. I ask folks to just slow down, to tune into their breath, to pay attention to the environment around them. Is it a cold day? Is it hot? Is it humid? Is your skin feeling really dry? Really tap into that present moment, and that's going to help you also tap into the arc of the dough.
How do you communicate that for folks who bake as much as you do and teach as much as you do? Because a lot of what you do today is teaching. How do you communicate those nuances of settling down and paying attention to your dough in writing?
It's tricky with cookbooks, which are very different from other types of writing about recipes or writing about food topics, because you have finite space on the page. And often your publisher is like, okay, can we condense this down to 2 pages instead of 3.5? So it's always sort of this question of, what do I include? What details are absolutely necessary for this recipe? And to me, or for me, baking is as much about a formula or a recipe as it is about the intuitive nature of connecting to the present moment and to what's going on in a bowl. So I try and strike a balance between just those descriptor words of the dough should be looking like this when it's at this stage, and when it gets to this stage, this is what it should feel like, and when it gets to this stage, this is what happens that tells you to do this next thing. And I think that when we do include, as cookbook authors, when we do include that kind of information, we're not just telling someone how to do something. We're trying to encourage people to have a critical eye, use critical thinking skills, and really understand what is going on and why you're doing what you're doing. And when you can do that, that's how you become a better baker, not by the outcome of or the success of your outcome. It's often a combination of success and failure that helps you learn how to do things better or differently. And I think those descriptive sentences or words can really help you get there. So I try to, when I can, strike a balance if possible.
Yeah. And, in your introduction to this book, you're really at that point introducing yourself to the baking world and introducing the book. And you talk about your background as working with ceramics and then also becoming really fascinated with plants and becoming a certified horticulturist and going through these phases of your life. And all these things to me sound like practices that benefit from slowing down and paying attention. And is this something that is you? Has this always been you? Or did you cultivate this through these many phases of craft that you've indulged in?
We may be getting into some deep philosophical topics here. But
that's what I'm hoping for. I think that's why we're here.
How much time do we have? Uh, no, I think that, that's kind of part of being a human being is sometimes we do things that we're very aware of, and sometimes we have no idea what we're doing, right?
Yeah.
Often we call that the shadow self. But I've always been very attracted to doing things with my hands, engaging my full body, engaging all of my senses. And I've often, when I've found sort of a pathway through that into creativity, for better or worse, I've often made that my profession. And I think part of that is just really craving the indulgence of being able to work with my hands and be in the moment and, be in this sort of constantly different sort of scenario, right? It's the same with clay, it's the same with gardening, it's the same with dough. It's always subject to forces outside of your control. And I think that for me personally, that's the part of baking that I love is it's always different. It always requires me to be a participant in the outcome of the dough, but also in just life in general, the beautiful forces of nature. Ceramics started when I was in college, when I was studying international business and feeling very unsatisfied or unfulfilled, and wound up, I was at a liberal arts school, so I wound up in the ceramic studio, and it felt like home. It felt like a place where I could let myself sort of unfurl and be in a very open and accepting environment of what that looked like. Unfortunately, whatever lessons I was supposed to learn in business class didn't really apply to being learning how to be an artist.
Yeah, that's
So
a
I
tricky one.
think I stumbled a little bit in my 20s through trying to become a business as an artist. And, long story short, I've really been lucky that I've been able to cultivate relationships with other people, other artists, other bakers who really value the things that I also value, and be able to reframe what it means to be a working creative person rather than having the focus be I need to pay my bills or I need to make it in the world. I need to be successful, whatever, definition that is. Now I think about how is it that I can use what I do, what inspires me to then inspire others. And I think with cookbooks, that's something that has a really direct effect.
I guess that's the nice thing about bread in general is like, people are hungry and you can feed them
Yeah.
and like, right. It's a simple economics. Um,
Yeah.
this book has a particularly personal place in my sourdough baking arc as a home baker. I started baking, really trying to figure out sourdough a little bit after this was published. And I remember sitting in the Barnes& and Noble in Union Square in Manhattan with a pile of books, and
Oh,
yours was in
wow.
there, right? And
Uh-huh.
and I particularly remember you talking about the gut and your connection with sourdough in the gut and the connection with plants. And I thought this was really kind of interesting at that point, even though many of the recipes were probably beyond my abilities at that stage in my life. So 10 years out, having the success of this book, but also all the feedback and all the conversations that have probably happened because of this book, how has this book impacted your life?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and I'm curious though, at that time, what kind of little changes do people will they discover if they got the 10th anniversary edition?
Sure. So, just to give a little context, I started writing sourdough in 2013. I had, of course, been, baking before that, but, I really did not at that time have this long career of baking behind me. I'm also self taught. And at that time, back in 2010, 11, there weren't the resources that we have now available to learn how to shape a loaf or what does a loaf look like when it's proofing, and, this kind of thing. So a lot of writing that book was sometimes, not always, but sometimes inventing language around what I was experiencing and some of the things that really at that time were almost all rooted in the European tradition of baking. And so now I think what's different just about being a cookbook author in general, but specifically a baking cookbook author, is that our knowledge and our language and our appreciation for baking well outside of the European tradition has greatly expanded. We definitely need more
Mm-hmm.
of that. But I think that now I am speaking to an audience that has not only hopefully used this book in their own baking practice, but has also had exposure to many different resources online, other amazing cookbook authors, workshops. There's so many hands-on in-person workshops now, online workshops. So I think collectively, we really have such a deeper appreciation for what baking can be. But there's also so many people that have never opened a bag of flour that are like, I'd kind of like to make a loaf of bread.
Yeah.
So it's an exciting time really to be putting this out, because just from a sales point of view, it's shown that it has evergreen value, which is, I think, for me, for someone who really appreciates the value of things in the world. Like, I don't want to just be putting more stuff into the world. I really value the evergreen nature of something, whether it's a cookbook or a sculpture or a garden. So re-releasing this with some small edits, mostly in response to questions I've gotten over and over and over again.
Yeah, totally.
Like, could you tell me why I'm roasting 600 grams of beets when I'm only using 300?
And the answer is,
Oh gosh. Well, the answer is you're losing water weight, right, when you're
okay, that's what I
roasting.
guessed.
And then also there's always a piece that falls on the floor. And then you always need to nibble. You always need to taste what you're working with. You always need to know what you're working with.
That, I have to say, is the subtle level of experience that I think in some ways separates your work from others. It's like the obvious thing, I think, is loss of water. And like most technical sources will tell you that. But to encouraging people to taste what they cook as they go is like, that's like a little thing that makes a big difference. And then the leaving space for accidents, and those are important lessons to like,
oh, they're so important.
Being a good baker and to, keep going with it. One of the other things that, obviously is very unique about this book and your work in general is you articulated the connection between the garden outside your door, the garden in your jar of starter, and then the garden in your belly. And I think you have this gardener's kind of point of view. And this is a kind of a metaphor that comes up a lot, I think, with some bakers. How's your views around that evolved?
Well, I think the foundation is still the same. So really learning how to appreciate how this unseen world has an effect on our lives in so many different capacities. But the wonderful thing is that science has really, now we have a lot of hurdles to get through in terms of grant funding for research, but we are much more invested in understanding that world from a scientific point of view. And so I've had the opportunity to work with different microbial scientists over the years. And I think it's fascinating to just give ourselves over to the fact that there's so much that we don't understand. We are learning more and more every day, every year. And the notion that microbes affect the soil health, which then affects the nutritional uptake of the plant, of what micronutrients and nutrients are available in the soil, and then that gets passed on to potentially our own bodies, and then working with or harnessing the power of microbes to be able to uptake or absorb those nutrients and vitamins. It's a long, complicated process. As humans, I think we try to simplify everything as much as possible, but it's a beautiful thing to be able to just understand that we are connected to everything. We're connected to the soil, we're connected to each other, we're connected to the sun, we're connected to the plants. in so many different ways. And unfortunately, the industrial complex of agriculture these days, it really has disconnected us from a lot of that, or from understanding a lot of how soil health influences the nutritional density of our foods. But it's possible. It's possible to develop relationships with farmers, with millers, with bakers, with ourselves in new old ways to make that aspect of our food system more important, and to really, I think, support the decisions that are important to, just making sure that we're taking care of each other and taking care of this beautiful earth.
That's one thing I love about sourdough and introducing people to it, because it is such a great way to connect to food and where the food comes
Mm-hmm.
from. It does make me feel like it is misnamed, though. It's like we focus on the sourness of it, whereas it really,
Mm,
I think the thing that I always pick up on is like it's just a sourdough bread, naturally fermented bread nourishes you more, and
yeah.
we understand that in part through taste, but there's just like
Mm-hmm.
a subtle kind of quality of fullness to fermented foods in general, but a fermented bread. And I think you start to realize if you eat that bread regularly compared to something from a grocery store, And
Mm-hmm.
my wife tells me I've ruined bread for her, and I feel like that's good. That's what we're all trying to do. It's just like ruin all the other breads, and just like our little sourdough microbes taking over our jar. We're gonna
Yeah.
take over bread. Um, I do feel like travel is also a big part of your DNA. I sense it in this book and some
Mm-hmm.
of the recipes. I know you've done trips and stuff for some of your teaching and work with other cultures. And how has travel influenced you as a person who creates recipes? And then also, maybe you could give a couple tips for people who do travel and work in different environments with sourdough. And
Mm.
obviously, environments are different, so things can act different in your kitchen.
Oh my gosh, so different. Yeah. And I think as people who are trying to learn how to work with sourdough, or really anything that's subject to the environment, the fluctuations of our environment, we learn in a controlled setting. We learn in our home. We learn using the flour that we have access to. And then when we travel, it's like all that goes out the window.
Totally.
We're going from, uh, you know, dry summer in California to like hot and humid tropics of Costa Rica, or wherever we might find ourselves. And everything's just completely different. The dough
Yeah.
behaves differently, your starter behaves differently. And of course, there's, also many ways that we can measure the fermentation of dough beyond touch and taste and smell. And when I'm working with people when I travel, sometimes it's on a consulting basis. So it's really necessary to implement systems that are more concentrated on consistency. When I'm baking, let's say leading a retreat, or I'm working with people in a mutual sort of learning capacity, which is my preference, that's when I'm able to bring in local customs, local ingredients, really understand the context of a culture. And then often I'm coming into those situations because I've been invited into those situations. And so then those folks that I'm working with also want to learn from me. And so I'm bringing in those technical skills. And so the idea in those situations is to really form a marriage between all of that, right? And create something that's very unique and individual to that moment in time. And that's where I like to spend as much time as possible when I'm traveling, is those moments of being able to feel like you can offer something, but
Hmm.
also learn, and really immerse yourself in a place and the ingredients and where they come from and the customs around
Yeah.
making those ingredients.
And how do you bring that back to your writing? Like, is that time, like R&D for you, or it is that more of an emotional recharge?
I would say definitely both. It's sometimes, like when I lead retreats in like, Sicily or Sardinia or other parts of the world, it's very specific. Like we have 5 days and this is what we're doing. And day
Yeah.
1, day 2, so it's very much very structured. But when I am just traveling on my own, or even during those retreats, I'm really looking to be as open as possible to accepting and learning and absorbing whatever is coming. And sometimes, that fluctuates depending upon the producer or just what else is going on in the world,
Hmm.
because there's a lot there's a lot going on in the world, and the conversations that are brought up around the lifestyles that are required to sometimes produce these ingredients, or to even maintain and hold on to these certain traditions. There's a lot of discussion around how far do we go to try and maintain those traditions? Are these traditions helpful to our culture? Are they locking us into identities that are no longer applicable to certain types of people? Right? Or certain types of lifestyles. So there's a lot of conversation that I think comes with learning about culture and learning about, food through the lens of culture, or culture through the lens of food, that it's always changing. It's always different. And I try not to be so precious about any of it that I'm not open to sort of absorbing what's happening in the moment. So how that translates to a book, is often very different. And I think with books, we tend to over romanticize things because it makes a good story, right? And it's the same with many different mediums: film, music, poetry. We like to tell a story. So it's very tempting to create a story that people, want to fall in love with. So I really try to convey the stories or the information that I learn from traveling. I try to convey it in a way that is very honest and provides a window through my lens. And of course, everybody has their own way of looking at things. And I also try to really be open to and accepting of the fact that, like, I'm limited by my own experience. So I'm never an authority on someone else's culture or traditions, but I can be appreciative of them. And particularly when I am using them as a springboard for my own work, I think it's important to honor where it came from, particularly if I am doing it very differently than how it's typically done. And
Hmm.
there are many places where I work that are so rooted in tradition, that anything outside of that is just like,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. And, and that's obviously even the risk today of sourdough becoming an orthodoxy. I totally agree with you. Like, I feel like food is sort of the root of all culture, and it's really this great lens for understanding yourself and the world. And I'm really fascinated here. I live in Western North Carolina, in Asheville. That's part of the
Hmm.
Appalachia region of the United States. I think you're from
Yeah.
Kentucky originally, right? So maybe
I'm
you,
from East Tennessee,
oh, East Tennessee, right? So
right over the border.
so you were just over there. So, like, this kind of land is the land of quick breads. It's like biscuits and like cornbread, and
Hmm.
like maybe perhaps because the flours are not suitable to what we think of as like a farmer's market loaf of sourdough today, or because of economic circumstance or other kind of things, that like the bread
Hmm.
traditions have evolved to not be fermented. And I know in your book you find ways to kind of sneak sourdough in all kinds of different recipes, which is great for people who look to do that. When you encounter these traditions that are,
Hmm.
not using fermented strategies, how do you respond to that? Or how do you feel about that fermented, not fermented line in food culture?
Yeah. I'm just a naturally curious person, always. And I always want to know the context of what it is now, and also the history of what it once was and how that's changed, particularly in the lens of more modern agricultural means and methods. And, a lot of, not all, but a lot of countries that I visit have very industrialized systems of agriculture that often strip things down. And, when we're talking about flour, I'm often working with very, very refined flour. And as an ingredient, you work with that kind of flour very differently than, let's say, something that has been grown in an organic system, has maybe different proportions of bran, endosperm, and germ, been milled on a stone mill, has retained all of that nutritional value, which then influences fermentation, microbial activity. So it's, to me, it's like I have to understand all of that, right, in order to really appreciate what something is now and what it maybe used to be when maybe land access to a small farmer was a lot easier, or when stone mills were part of a community where everyone brought their grain, or there was a communal oven where everybody brought their dough. All of that is context to what something is now and also what it could be. So when I'm thinking about, my personal motivations for bringing something back to my kitchen to feed myself, I'm invested in a certain way. I want my body to feel good. I want to be able to digest something well. If I give it to my neighbors, I want them to like it, And there's many different influences that, could qualify something as tasty versus, nutritious.
Yeah, absolutely. It cultivates a lot of empathy. Fortunately, people generally like gifts and generally like
Mhm.
sourdough. So we start with
Mhm.
a 1 foot forward. Just to get into your book a little bit, like, do any of these recipes hold a warm spot in your heart, particularly for you, as you look
Mhm.
back on them?
Well, every recipe in that book has a story. And often the recipe is associated with a friend or a trip or something. So it's challenging. When I had a micro bakery in New York, there were also recipes that I would make over and over again from that book because people just love them.
Ah,
So I think
okay.
about like the turmeric loaf, that has different flavors of allium and seeds and texture. And I always say that loaf, it's like a warm bowl of soup, but in loaf form, because it's very comforting. And I think
Yeah.
obviously, when people eat it, it feels very comforting. But even when you're making it in the kitchen, the smells, the aromas that emanate throughout the process, it's this immersive experience that I love making that loaf. But it's a strongly flavored, it has character and identity that's not gonna be your everyday loaf,
Yeah, that's the
right?
centerpiece of a meal
Yeah.
kind of thing. Yeah, that's actually something I think your book, the complexity of flavor, you use a lot of inclusions, you're using
Mm.
a lot of you're bringing from the plant world a lot. And this is not, I would say, the beginner's book per se. Like, there's not even like something I would even call like your classic country loaf until I think spring, when you talk about your Brooklyn sourdough in this.
Uh-huh.
And like, you're immediately jumping people into quite complicated flavors. I guess when you're working with people in your classes and like when you're
Mhm.
introducing kind of things like this, how do you help people understand how you use inclusions in bread like you do in these recipes,
Mm.
and also finding flavor combinations that really work?
One of the wonderful things about that happened in 2020 was that I was kind of forced to start working online, to start teaching online.
Uh-huh.
And what was good about that is I was able to cultivate an audience of people who wanted to learn and who I could work with consistently over time. When I'm teaching an in-person workshop, it's usually like it's a destination. People come for a certain amount of time. I focus on a topic or a subject or trying to learn how to, work in inclusions or whatever the topic may be. And it's that experience and it's usually a wonderful thing. But then people go back to their kitchens and sometimes it works, incorporating it into their practice, and sometimes it doesn't. So, with something like inclusions, often what I'll do is just make that the topic and not just of a workshop, but often like a series of formulas or recipes. And then, really start off with that topic in a class or a workshop and then take it to the next level in the next class or workshop. And then, keep going with it the definition of how to think about building a foundation for something, like incorporating porridges or cooked vegetables or whatever, and then building on that. So it's always, I think with any skill, you want to create a foundation. With my third book, Heirloom, I have a table loaf, and that is now my everyday staple loaf. Either that or I increase the amount of whole grain flour. So more lately, it's been like a 40% whole grain, 60% refined flour loaf. But starting with a foundational loaf, whether it's the 60/40 or the table loaf or whatever it is that makes you happy, and then using that foundational loaf to then, okay, let's expand outward. Let's start making things a little more complicated. Let's fold in a porridge. Let's make a specific porridge. Let's use the leftovers from yesterday's breakfast or last night's, grits, shrimp and grits dinner. Like, maybe not the shrimp, but let's think about how we do that and why and what makes it successful or maybe not.
One of the things I think this book does is it does serve as inspiration. It's like, it's lovely. You work with Nak Min No, who's been your, I think, photographer across all your books. And it's, there's lovely examples of lovely breads. But then I think you organize this book seasonally. And so by maybe entering into the book through that seasonal lens, you at least start with the handicap of what's available. And there's a certain amount of complementary nature to things that grow together,
Yes.
and I think that is a good place to start if you're thinking about building more complicated flavors.
What grows together goes together.
Yeah, there you go.
Repetitive.
Yeah, that's the phrase I was looking for. Thank you. I'm glad I have a writer with me.
Yeah.
So you've written 3 books so far, and I know you are now working on a 4th. Tell us about this book. Give us a little preview of what this will be.
Yeah, so Sourdough Rising is going to be the 4th book, and I love that I've been able to work with the same publisher for all 4 books, because at this point, this was their suggested title. And what I love about that is it totally encapsulates what I try to do as a cookbook author, as a culinary educator, as someone who's remarkably curious about the world and just always has itchy feet, always on the road traveling. So I'm really lucky that I'm able to work with a publisher who gets what I do. And the title Sourdough Rising, I think it gives me an incredible direction to be able to not just create seasonal recipes, to encourage people to, use the abundance of what's available to them. And even that, has changed. Like our seasons are completely, what are seasons anymore, right? It's also seasonally divided. And so that is a topic of the book. It's incredible.
So this is survival baking as much as anything else.
Oh, gosh. In some ways, though, in some ways, I feel like so many people do feel like they're trying to survive this crazy world we're living in. And I'm hoping that baking can be a pathway to not just survival, but to being able to connect with each other and ourselves in a way that is very nurturing and nourishing. So, without being too whimsical, the idea of how do we rise? How do we get our dough to rise? But how then does that help us rise collectively, individually? And there's so many answers to that, right? There's so many ways that we can think about that. But I'm just so grateful to have the opportunity to be able to write more recipes or more formulas to help people be able to do that in their own small circles or their own communities, because that's, I think, where we learn how to create care, and we learn how to be a better baker and make a better loaf of bread or a better cake or whatever it is. But it's how we improve, the lives of ourselves and other people through those acts of care, which that is baking. You're pouring so much into something, and then you're passing that on to someone else, either through breaking the bread together or knocking on somebody's door and just dropping it off. It's such a profound act that I think we take for granted sometimes, you know? So just being able, having the chance to do that again a fourth time is like so grateful.
Totally. Yeah, I totally resonate with that. My community was hit by, a hurricane last year and
Yeah.
was affected a lot. And I did find the way it really reframed food, without refrigeration, the
Hmm.
benefits of fermentation, the benefits of being able to provide a neighbor with a loaf of bread during a stressful time,
Yeah.
being able to help local bakeries find the
Hmm.
ingredients to make bread to give away to people who are hungry. When times get tough, like it's amazing how all the benefits of baking and bread and the way it connects communities really
Hmm.
surfaces. And
Yeah.
it's fascinating. But also, like, not only from the environmental disaster point of view, but like culture has changed a lot in the last 10 years since you wrote your first
Hmm.
book, just like among the
Yeah.
sourdough community, right? Yeah, there's so much more education available, information, like you mentioned. I remember watching a video you did with Food 52, and I was just like learning how to like
Mm.
shape and stuff. It was really great on YouTube back in the day. And like, but there's like so much more now. So, what's it like starting to kind of like step forward into writing a fourth book in the culture of sourdough today?
Yeah. It's a really interesting process because there is so much more information available, and yet I can't take it for granted that people haven't accessed that or have accessed that, right? And so when you're writing an instructive manual to something, you do kind of have to assume that someone has never made a loaf of bread before or they've
Hmm.
never seen a YouTube video or whatever the case may be.
Yeah,
But also, the access that we have to a much wider range of ingredients has greatly increased. And so now, when I wrote Sourdough in 2013, local small stone ground mills were starting to come online, but it was still very much you really had to seek them out. And you still have to seek those resources out, but they're much more available, particularly through things like mail order. And so I kind of have to not only instruct you how to use store-bought flour off of the shelf, which many people will start with because that's just from an affordability perspective. When you're not sure if a loaf of bread's going to turn out okay or not, you're probably going to want to use the $2 pound flour rather than the $6 pound flour. you know,
totally. Yeah.
so there's a much wider, I think, range of information that has to be conveyed for folks who are picking up a cookbook or a baking book that are just starting, and then those who are like, this is the fourth book I have of yours on my shelf, and I want to build upon what I've learned in the last 10 years. So it is a little bit tricky in terms of making sure to give enough information, but not overwhelming folks with too much information, because there are some cookbooks that I've picked up in the last couple years that I look at them and I'm like, oh, where do I start? And, what I'm aiming to do really is to, yes, be instructional, but I also, I want to fill that gap between, I feel like a lot of times with whether it's baking or cooking or fermenting anything, there is this disconnect between anything outside of our kitchens, right? And what we're doing to produce a loaf of bread or a meal for ourselves or other people. And the garden for me is very much an inspiration. And I hope to inspire people, even if they don't have access to being able to grow a garden, to at least connect with the larger natural world outside of their kitchen. And it's become a huge part of my identity as a cookbook author, because it's just a reflection of who I am and what inspires me.
I'm excited for this book. I feel like the hardest thing is to, if you want to learn more about something, is to get beyond that 101 class or that 101
Hmm.
book, because everybody has
Yeah.
a certain obligation, like you say, to speak to that audience, because that's always the biggest
Hmm.
audience. Like there's always more people don't know about your thing than they do.
Hmm.
But it's like food is culture, and like using food as a gateway into talking about bigger things is always like I think the most fascinating writing, and it's also
Yeah.
something that again I think inspires people to not just make a loaf or two and give it a shot, but to understand that
Hmm.
like this is a journey that can be as big and as go as deep as you want it to take it,
Yeah.
and there's room for everybody. It's
Yeah.
like whatever.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's like you just want to feed your family, you want to become professional, you want to bake on the holidays,
Yes.
wherever you live on the political spectrum, wherever you live in the country, there's a place for you in this practice, and it's really great. And I just appreciate like what you're doing, and anybody's helping people take a step, in making their food, maybe going from store-bought bread to sourdough. I feel like that's a step in the
Hmm.
right direction.
Yeah. Stay curious.
Yeah, totally.
Stay curious. Ask those questions.
Totally. What brings us together is the occasion of the 10th anniversary of sourdough,
Hmm.
recipes for rustic fermented breads, sweets, savories, and more. James Beard winning first book from a multi-cookbook author now, Sarah Owens. Thank you for being here and talking with me and sharing your insights with our audience. And where can people learn more about your work and take a class from you and do that sort of thing?
Sure. So my website, ritualfinefoods.com, there's an events page that lists all of my both online and in-person classes. So there are links to how to register to all of those on that website, on that events page. And then I have a subscription platform on Patreon. So you can subscribe for free and get access to newsletters. But you can also join at the basic level and have access to almost 170 unique recipes now, and also workshop once a month through Zoom. So that's at the basic level. And then if you are someone who has a lot of questions and need, counseling or tutorials one-on-one, there are options for that as well. And then I'm always open to traveling and showing up at somebody's door
All
if you
right.
want to have me.
You could have Sarah Owens at your home. It's not just imagination.
Just feed me.
If you feed her, she will help you slow down. Like, you'll make some great bread together.
We'll go real slow.
Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate this time.
Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. If you'd like to learn more about Sour House, you can learn about us at sourhouse.co. And if this was a valuable companion for you today, maybe as you were baking a loaf of bread, I hope you'll tune in to other episodes and share it with your friends.